It is generally accepted that in times of war, there are going to be casualties. There are going to be those who lose their lives inevitably because of enemy contact. Now, would you believe me if I told you that it is not the case that everyone that loses their lives in a time of war dies because an enemy killed them? No, there have been several instances in which people have died because of what we call friendly fire. It's when people on the same side get confused in the act of war and they turn on each other. And although they were fighting for the same goal, because they did not have the truth of who the true enemy was, people have lost their lives. To the Christian, truth is of utmost importance, and especially knowing who the true enemy is. In Ephesians chapter 6, in verses 10 through 20, we find Paul giving an example of what the Christian soldier is to put on, what we commonly refer to as the armor of God, because we are in a war this morning. This is not uncommon for Paul to make the application between a Christian and a soldier. When he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he encourages Timothy. He says, "Endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." Later in that same epistle, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, when Paul is describing his own personal faith, he says, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall bestow upon me, and not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing." It's not uncommon for Paul to make the application between a Christian and a soldier. And that's exactly what we find within the context of Ephesians chapter 6, except here he goes more in depth. He says we're not only soldiers, but we have a uniform to put on. And this morning we're going to be examining the first piece of the uniform that we are to put on. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 14 says, "Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth." I'd like to take a moment and remind you who it is that Paul is writing to. He's writing to the Christians at Ephesus. And think to yourselves where Paul is when he is writing this. He is sitting in a Roman prison under house arrest. And can you imagine in your minds him looking over and seeing one of the very Roman guards that are in charge of keeping him in that prison, and yet doing what Paul has done on so many other occasions, using his surroundings to preach the gospel? Can you imagine him looking at that Roman soldier and examining his uniform and then beginning to write to the Christians at Ephesus? And he begins with this very piece of clothing, what is commonly referred to as the belt of truth. "Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth." Does that phrase sound familiar to you? The concept of having your loins girt about? If you'll remind yourselves of the Old Testament, when the Lord is instructing Moses and the children of Israel on how they are to prepare themselves for the Passover and how they are to partake of that feast and get ready for the task at hand. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 11 says, "And thus shall you eat it, with your loins girded and your shoes on your feet and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." So this phrase, to have your loins girded, means to prepare yourself for the task at hand. Get ready so that you have free movement. For the Roman soldier, they would use this belt, and they would tuck in any extra clothing that they may have on them. They would make sure that there was nothing hindering their movement so that they could be the best soldier that they could possibly be, nothing getting in their way. That is our goal, to remove anything that is hindering us from being the best soldier in God's army. We put away those distractions and we gird up our loins in truth. I'd like to take a moment and just discuss a few people throughout biblical history who girded up their loins, but they did not gird up their loins in truth, and they paid a consequence because of that. First of which is Eve in the Garden of Eden. you'll notice that with one simple word, Satan was able to convince Eve to gird up her loins to action and to partake of that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She girded up her loins, and yet she did not gird up her loins in truth. And are there not some serious consequences that are resulting even to this day because of her not girding up her loins to truth? The most important being that sin entered into the world and death by sin. But if there are any mothers attending this morning, is there not a serious consequences to anyone that has gone through the pains of childbirth because Eve did not gird up her loins in truth? We could look at Jonah, as Tobias and Cody have already mentioned this week. The word of the Lord came unto Jonah. And do not forget the fact that this was a prophet of God. This was not a random person. This was a prophet of God. The word of the Lord comes to Jonah, and he says, "Arise, go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching which I bid thee." And Jonah girds up his loins. He prepares himself for action. But he didn't gird up his loins in truth. He prepares himself and he flees from the presence of the Lord, or at least he tries to. And of course, there are consequences to his actions. He ended up having to spend 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. But the Lord is able to take all things and use them for good, isn't he? That is a wonderful representation of how Christ spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, in that tomb. But Jonah's situation could have been avoided if he had merely girded up his loins with truth to begin with. The last example we'll look at comes from the New Testament, in which Christ describes a group of people on the day of judgment. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, he describes a group of people considered to be many. And he says, "Many will come to me in that day and say, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name done many wonderful works? They have girded up their loins to do the work of the Lord, but they haven't girded up their loins in truth. And it will result in the Lord saying, depart from me, ye that work iniquity, I never knew you." This is a prophecy. This is something that hasn't taken place yet. So each one present in attendance this morning has the personal responsibility to make sure that you're not a part of that group that is considered to be many on the day of judgment. We have to gird up our loins in truth if we are to be judged in a pleasing light. Why is it that we are to gird up our loins in truth? What benefit would it be to us? Well, if we look within the context of our text in Ephesians chapter 6, notice verse 11. It says, "Put on the whole armor of God." The whole armor of God, including this belt of truth, to gird up our loins in truth. Put on that whole armor of God that we may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a war going on this morning, and each one in this building is participating in that war. Each one in every building is participating in that war. Each one in the entire world who has ever lived and ever will live is participating in that war. And the inspired Apostle Paul has given us instructions on how we are to prepare ourselves to stand against the devil in that war. And notice the very first thing he tells us to do in preparing ourselves for this war. Gird up your loins with truth. Do not take this for granted. Do not forget it. Let us apply this truth to ourselves, and let us go out and teach it to others. Thank you for your kind attention.